Anyway, I appreciate the Program Planning Committee for giving me this opportunity to be here with you. And I'm so pleased to see so many people who have an interest in this topic, and thank you for being here. Appreciate that. It's a real privilege for me to be here and to share this topic with you. And as Jeanette mentioned, it is a little different perspective, I think, than some people are used to hearing anyway. So I'm going to present a lot of information on slides, and then at the end of this first portion, about 50 minutes from now, we'll have a little time for some questions, some discussion, feedback, comments, and then we'll do a second portion. At the end of that, we'll have another opportunity for comments and discussion and questions. So as she's kind of told you already a little bit about the working group, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And she mentioned my affiliation with Oregon State, where I do some lectures on this topic and a variety of others as well for the Global Health Program, for the Public Health Program. I live in Newport, so I'm a commuter once in a while. I'm going to talk a little bit about first about what public health is, because sometimes people aren't sure. I've got to disclose this financial. I'm going to talk about a book that's coming out, she mentioned, later this year, so a little financial conflict of interest there. But I've been talking about this and studying it for a long time, so the book is a nice product, but it's not the main feature. So these are what I'm going to try to go over with you some today. I'm going to try to define public health a little bit for you, identify some health effects of war, and I'm going to illustrate what we call militarism, give a little bit of peace history, and summarize some of the role for public health in the role in preventing war, and talk a little bit about what we as individuals can do as well. So public health, sometimes people confuse that with medical and general health care, but in public health, we're focused on trying to help reduce risk factors, to promote health and to prevent disease for entire populations, in contrast to the medical professions that deal typically with one individual patient at a time. So we're more broad, community-wide, more global. So these are the kind of things that we do focus on: the protection of health, the promotion of health, and prevention of disease. And this is kind of important to help understand why I'm going to present some of the other things I'm going to talk about. This is a kind of a simplistic model of the way we operate in public health in terms of what causes disease or what promotes health. So we kind of view it, again, as simplistic, and it's much more complex and interactive than this shows, but we look at things from upstream to downstream. The downstream being closest to where an illness occurs, where a disease occurs. And if we walk back up the stream a little bit, looking for what causes that condition, that state of health or the disease or illness, there are some behaviors well known to us, like smoking, about physical inactivity, about our diet. We move a little bit further back upstream, we look at their medical services. So if people don't have good access to health care, adequate health care, then that impacts their health downstream. And then there are environmental factors like toxic chemicals, as an example of what some of those causes might be. But we also begin to look at the social environment. So at this end of the far upstream, we call those the root causes. So we look at genetics, of course, is a factor there, but income inequality, for example, and the poverty, lack of education, those kinds of things that influence the downstream result. And we're learning more and more about how that actually happens. So public health, we focus on all of these areas, but our main emphasis is moving upstream as much as possible to try to address these root causes, what's underlying, not what's right immediate before the health problem, although we do try to address that, lots of smoking cessation programs, for example, and prevention programs for kids. But this is what we are trying to get at, those root causes, those social, environmental, economic, political causes. And so that's what I'm going to be addressing mostly today, is this upstream causes of violence, war. So just to give you some examples, this is kind of the broad range of what public health is. So we collect and monitor the vital statistics, the births, the deaths, the injuries, those kinds of things. We can drink out of our tap water. Janet provided me some here. It's safe because public health is taking care of setting up, establishing the standards in the purification of water so that we don't get cholera from drinking water if we drink it out of the tap in the U.S. And we have smoke-free smoke-free restaurants. Those policies arose because public health was involved in the establishment of those and the advocacy. We have seat belts and airbags, which prevent a lot of deaths and injuries from automobile wrecks. Public health, again, it's a role there. We have unleaded gasoline and paint that's less lead. Again, emphasis from the research and advocacy done through public health. We have cancer screenings of various kinds for whole populations. That's, again, a public health intervention. And, of course, vaccinations is a long-known and long-established public health role where entire schools and communities are vaccinated. So I'm going to show a few slides about war. Some of them could be disturbing to people who have experienced some of these kinds of things, seen them, or have family who have. So I always show some helplines where you can call to get some assistance if you find some of these things to be a bit disturbing for you. So the first sort of endpoint that we look at, and of course in public health, is in trying to prevent death. And so same with war, whether it's disease or war. The 20th century was the bloodiest we've had, more than the last 4 centuries, 190 million deaths from war. If we look at the specifics of, let's say, the injuries to the members of the military and the effects on their family, just talking specifically about Afghanistan and Iraq, there's traumatic brain injury. Probably 19% of the veterans of those wars have experienced traumatic brain injury. From 14 to 23% experience post-traumatic stress disorder. And you can see that the veteran here who has physical effect, in part due to the type of war that we have, but also to the medical interventions that we have that are able to save some lives now, and the equipment and so on. Families also experience, well, let me go back again here, some more physical things from the veterans themselves. We know that about 22 veterans a day commit suicide. It's a much larger proportion, 7,000 to 8,000 a year, much larger proportion of suicides among the veterans than there is in the general population. The families experience higher levels of stress and trauma, mental health issues, psychological vulnerabilities, and marital discord. And these things are exacerbated when there are multiple deployments or overseas. Now, and those are just a few of the things. There's higher alcohol abuse. There's a very acute stress, and that occurs to all the soldiers. But in addition, the women who are in the military experience some additional things through the discrimination that they occur, the sexual harassment, and as well as rape. There are probably in Afghanistan and Iraq, 41% of the women experience harassment, 10% sexual assault. But in the military overall, women experience, some studies show 30% have experienced rape and 5% gang rape included. So in addition to all the other kinds of traumas that anyone, for example, a male would face in terms of the psychological and physical damage that they experience, they also have that piled on top of them, which also has a number of effects even beyond what I've described already. There's another effect that's called moral injury. And this is when someone participates in, observes, or doesn't prevent something that is in very direct and strong conflict with their basic moral values, their ethics, and their expectations for themselves. And of course, the prohibition on killing is directly in our society is along one of those values. And so when they go into a war and are required to kill, that sometimes conflicts with those values and causes what's called moral injury. And as this veteran says, he'll be challenged by that for the rest of his life. But as much as the combatants experience the harmful effects of war, the greater experience is from the civilians. Probably 85 to 90% of the casualties in war is to the civilians. There are probably 10 civilian deaths for every 1 combatant deaths. In addition to those deaths and injuries, they have lots of other experiences. Their homes are destroyed, the infrastructure of their community, the water systems, the healthcare systems, medical care, that's damaged, destroyed. They're displaced from their homes, required to leave their homes, to flee their homes, to flee their communities. And that puts them at an additional risk. If their agricultural land is often destroyed, so resulting in food insecurities. They don't have enough to eat and proper nutrition. So there's a lot of the experiences from war that are direct impacts on civilians. And here is sort of typical. The immigration effects, migration effects, maybe 50% of migrants now are children. Whether we go back to World War II, for example, this woman whose family was killed and homes destroyed, or current military excursions that we have. And again, there are some civilian side effects, as we know here in Oregon very well, the Japanese that were imprisoned. So after, in World War I, mostly the combatant deaths, or the result of the actual battles, the deaths were and injuries were to the combatants, the military. Civilians had deaths from a little bit from that, but from diseases and so on as well. But in World War II, things changed to where civilians became more targeted. We had the fire bombings of Dresden, we had bombs in Tokyo, and then of course we had Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we have developed kind of a new way of war where civilians are the direct ones who are attacked directly. So the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, each of those resulted in at least 130 to 150,000 deaths. And this is the current condition. This is how many nuclear warheads we still have in the world and how they're distributed. The United States and Russia hold the most, about 7,000 each, and then the other 9 countries are spread across that 15,000. Now, sometimes we hear comments that sort of make the use of nuclear weapons seem kind of trivial, and that they would be used sort of lightly with light consideration. But this just is an example. If a bomb the size of the one that was dropped on Hiroshima was centered right on this university, Willamette University, and these are various stages of the results, and with somewhat decreasing intensity, with the most intense being right here. This would result in over 20,000 deaths many of them immediately, in these areas particularly, and over 30,000 injuries. Now, just to give you an example of what we're talking about nowadays in terms of a bomb, this is a Hiroshima-sized bomb. But it's thought that the Trident submarine base, located just about 20 air miles from Seattle, has maybe 8 submarines. Each of those subs has 24 missiles. Okay, so 24 missiles each. Each of those missiles has 8 warheads. So 24 missiles, each with 8 warheads. And each of those bombs is 32 times as strong as this. Again, that's located just 20 miles, air miles, from downtown, just across the bay a little bit. And so this is, we're talking things that are very destructive. It's not to be considered lightly. So this is the reason there really is no medical response. Those people in that, for example, in that middle of that circle for Willamette University, they would be essentially dissolved by fire. The buildings would be destroyed. I mean, how can you treat people medically? If they're far out enough on that ring, they're still going to get radiation, and the radiation is going to be around for a long time. So there's no real adequate medical response. So the only thing we really can do is prevention. Now, continuing along a little bit with more recent, this new way of war are the drones, remotely controlled by pilots who may be halfway around the world, directing these drones with their missiles to target, and with lots of destruction, injuries, and death. And in fact, just to give you since September 11th of 2001, we've conducted more than 500 non-battlefield drone attacks, and resulting in over 4,000 people that were killed and many more wounded. A part of this new way of war is that it's intended to inflict the damage elsewhere in another country, not in our own, to keep the battlefield off of our own country, to decrease or minimize at least the effects on our own population. So that's basically what this sort of new way of war, new weapons are really all about. And the drone pilots, even though they are at a distance, are not without the effects that I've described already on military combatants. This is what one drone operator for 6 years, with his targets were Afghanistan and Iraq, he says, it broke my spirit. It went against everything that I had ever learned about honor and justice, about being a warrior, about holding yourself to higher standards. And we know from studies that those folks who operate those drones also experience PTSD. And some of the disturbance that they feel from that is because sometimes they are, watching through their cameras or flying that drone around and following those people, that they begin to have some recognition of them, as human beings, and sort of develop kind of a distant relationship, a feeling for them. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the causes of war. We know that there are many causes of war, from poverty and from despots ruling countries. There's a whole long list, but because militarism is so little recognized, it's become so ingrained into the U.S. society and others as well, that it's kind of unrecognized. People really aren't aware of how pervasive it is. And I'm going to give you some examples of that. And because we believe that it dominates our society to such an extent that this group, the Primary Prevention of War Prevention Group, working group, decided that needs to be more emphasized. So the things I'm going to be talking about is I call militarism, and I'm going to define that for you in a minute. I want you just to make it as clear as I can that I'm not talking about those individual members of the military, those veterans, and their families, whatever their family may be. I've already talked about how the war affects them in many detrimental ways. So we recognize that and we honor that. And what I'm going to talk about, again, is not directed to individuals, disparaging them at all. I'm talking about a much broader concept when I talk about militarism. And basically, this is kind of the way I'm looking at it. This person heads up a group called World Beyond War. He says wars are made by cultures that celebrate or tolerate war. And so that's some of the things I'm going to show you about how we do that in the U.S. So here's kind of a simplistic, some of the main points, I guess, of what militarism really is. It's an acceptance of violence as a solution. An excessive reliance on military and the threat of force above other options and above other approaches to resolving conflict and disputes. And beyond that, it's a normalization spreading throughout society, a normalization of war, but particularly in that preparation for war, where it's just accepted as an everyday thing. It's just a part of life, is to prepare for war and to be in a constant state of war, essentially. The Afghanistan war has gone on now for over 14 years. And in which the military institutions are prioritized above our institutions. And I'm going to give you some specific examples of how that occurs. So, talking about militarism, there are a whole, and I've cut a lot of these out, but just some examples. The military sort of spilling over into civilian society with just this example here of where from clothing for hunters and the weapons through the camouflage. Camouflage has become very common. Our vehicles, the type of vehicle, and this one is even camouflaged. You'll see lots of Hummers, and this was even a camouflage clothing. I don't know what she'd be trying to avoid going to a ball in that gown, but and of course toys. The military toys have become even more pervasive of all kinds. The kinds that were more available, say, when I was younger, although this wasn't, I don't think, but this certainly wasn't. So we're appealing to all kinds of genders and ages. Pretend fighting and elevating war as something to be sought after, admired, but they don't experience the consequences. There's no injuries from this pretend battles. There's no deaths. Some of you may be familiar with this author of The Little Prince. He was a French Free Air Force and died in that. He said, war is not an adventure. Reflecting back to that previous slide. It's not an adventure, it's a disease. It's like typhus. So I think he would disagree with these kinds of reenactments. And then, of course, our military-style weapons have spilled over into civilian society. Again. And we have a lot of heroes and military movies going all the way back to D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which was celebrating and describing the Ku Klux Klan, where the military supported that. The military is very connected to the movie industry. If the movie industry script gets approved by the military, and they have liaisons working on this time, if it gets approved, the military will provide them access to bases, to battleships, to aircraft carriers, to planes, to tanks, to soldiers, to the bases, at which may be at the expense of you and I. Sometimes the movie production companies are charged for it. Sometimes they're just provided. So they have this very close, tight-knit relationship which in a sense is a recruiting tool for the military. And that's the way they view it. That's why they would devote all those kinds of resources to it. The video game industry is developed in parallel and in conjunction with, very networked with the military establishment. The reason that so many of those video games are realistic is because they're based on real battle scenes, battle scenarios, I should say, that actually occurred, and because they have the military advising them in development of those games. But those games are used and procured by the military for training purposes. So they work very closely together that way. And in fact, the military likes to have people who are good at video games because that means there's less training required once they are enlisted. And there's a revolving door, as with many industries related to war, between the people in the video industry and the military. So the people in the military who maybe have been supervising and advising and working with the video folks in development of some videos may end up being an official, an officer in that corporation later on, and then working with their contacts in the military to continue the development of those video games. Another aspect of militarism is the spread of military holdings around the world. And the slide over here, it's not just the Pentagon when we think of military holdings. That's our first thing that comes to mind often, but this shows you some around the world where we have facilities. In fact, we have over 500,000 facilities the military does at 5,000 sites, more than 28 million acres, military facilities, 800 bases. The military owns 75% of all federal buildings in the United States, and 20% of the sites are outside of the U.S. The military has 300,000 housing units worldwide, and it has 170 golf courses and at least 4 resorts, even though there may be a public course right down the street or road from this. So they own a lot of facilities and land. Now, one of the reasons that this is important, besides the expense that is put into it, is that it creates some resentment amongst the countries, the people in the countries where these facilities are placed. Osama bin Laden actually said that was one of the motivations for his attacks on the United States, was the bases in his region. North Korea is part of the motivation for them developing nuclear weapons, or the military bases, other facilities that are nearby North Korea. We have lots of events which celebrate not just the veterans, but again, it's the military and the looking to the military as a solution to all of our problems. We have parades, we have monuments, we have museums of military aircraft, war aircraft, statues, and in contrast to other types of service that people give to society, such as the firefighters, the police, the teachers, those kind of things. This was a particularly prominent event to have the color guards and the flags and the flyovers at sporting events. And we know that this was a paid recruitment by the military, recruitment method. Although it evoked the patriotism and sort of respect for veterans, it was really a recruitment tool. They paid the NFL to hold these events at their football games. So what this kind of does, it can dampen any questioning of the motivations for the policies or the reasons for going to war. It may dampen down any kind of questioning about that, or people who are or maybe opposing to those policies and to that war. It's kind of an uncritical acceptance of war as a solution. And this is what another veteran for the U.S. Marine Corps did 2 tours in Iraq. He says, since returning home from the military, my greatest frustration has to be the hero worship that we as veterans are fated with. And he goes on to make some additional comments about how it's sort of unthinking, kind of, without examination of the policies that send people to war, and the sort of that societal acceptance of war and the preparation for war that I'm talking about. And then the United States is the world's #1 seller of arms, #1 supplier. The next closest is really far down. We do more than double the next highest seller of weapons. We also are the greatest procurer. In a year, we sell about $40 billion worth of weapons, and it's major companies. Military contractors are pervasive. They're often headed by ex-military members, but driving down the street of almost any town in the U.S., as you drive through, you can see the various stores that are there, some even including mom and pop operations. Almost all of them have had contracts with the military. You walk through your home and you look at the devices, the electronics and so on that you have in your home. Those companies have had contracts with the military. There are probably over 900,000 primary defense contracts that are awarded, that are in existence right now. And many of those prime contracts, there are subcontractors that are spread across the country in almost every congressional district. And people are employed in those districts. And so it makes it very difficult for a member of Congress to vote to lower the military budget, to cut it in some ways because the effects that it may have in her or his own community. And the contractors provide all kinds of services. We typically think about them building aircraft, but they provide all kinds of other services, from security for officers and for diplomats, to providing the food. They provide equipment, intelligence, communications, security systems, maintenance, the munitions, missile defense, all kinds of services like the food and other things. And at one time in Iraq, there was one contractor for every official military combatant. And there was the saying that contractor is the first to greet them when they land and the last to wave them goodbye when they leave. I'm going to just mention this because of how corporate profit is so often the driving force behind war and the preparation for war. In World War II, IBM was a complete partner with the Nazis in planning and carrying out the imprisonment and deaths of the Jewish population all across Europe. They created the punch cards, the programs to run those computer punch cards, the software to do the analysis, the training for the maintenance, totally in every camp. All the record keeping that was done in every camp was based upon IBM's. Whether it was them being hired out for slave labor, that was recorded and kept via IBM's contributions. The deaths were recorded. Everything was completely based upon IBM. And in fact, this number that many Jewish people still alive have, but all of them had, that was, its origin was the IBM number. General Motors, the Nazi Blitzkrieg would not have happened without General Motors. It was the Nazis' chief truck and car manufacturer. They owned and operated the German Opel car company. Oh, I'm off of that microphone a little bit. Okay. They owned the Opel company. They continued through the war. In fact, probably a number of you in here watch PBS stations, and you'll often see the name of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation come up, being funding for some of those programs. He was head of GM at the time and would not stop because of what was happening here in the war. Ford Motor Company also contributed vehicles, probably a third of the vehicles of the Nazis. And it was still, 52% was still owned by Ford. And they, actually the manufacturing facilities in Germany used slave labor. So the military industry weighs some of its influence, not only through those congressional leadership that I've talked about, but also in the 2016 election cycle that we just completed not long ago. They contributed over $28.5 million to the election campaign. And in 2016, they put up about $93 million for lobbying. Now, this is not as large as some corporations do, some industries do, because they are so connected. There's so much exchange, so that revolving door, they have such close connections already with the Pentagon that they don't have to do as much lobbying, and they don't have to do as much in the election campaigns as some other industries do. So I'm going to spend a bit of time on the budget, and so this is kind of how they influence the budgets that I'm going to be talking about. Through the lobbying that they do to make sure the budgets are kept, and if some member of Congress looks at something and says they want to cut that or should reduce that or put that money into something else, they've got their lobbyists on hand, and they help them get elected. We know that those election campaign funds do make a difference. And then the revolving door, where somebody in industry goes in and works in the Pentagon. Somebody from the Pentagon may not monitor those contracts really closely because many of those people in the Pentagon end up going into that industry, and they want to make sure they get a good job offer, which is very lucrative. So that creates some lack of accountability and lack of accountability in terms of these open-ended contracts, no-bid contracts with little oversight, and this geographic distribution of their subcontracts. And then Congress, you know, they get a lot of inside kind of information that they can use to make their own investments. So even though Congress, most people are wealthy when they go in, they come out even wealthier. I'm going to talk more about the budget later, but I want to talk a little bit about the poverty draft. The draft ended in 1972, as most people in this room are aware. So that required that the military develop a lot of new recruiting techniques to get people to enlist. It had to be really, really quite innovative. And even particularly in 2008, 7, that time period when we were having a real recession, then these financial incentives became very important that they developed. So to get people to enlist, they offer a lot of different incentives, a lot of new recruiting methods, which would attract people, particularly with lower income that we have in some communities of color and rural communities like we have here in Oregon, where there's not a lot of opportunity, for jobs and for education and advancement that way. So the military, it provides housing, provides health care, it's a job, it's a career, it can provide money for education after you leave the military. You're prepared to do some kind of a job once you leave the military. And because of the respect that we all offer to members of the military, it gives some esteem to people who may not have many other outlets or opportunities for that as well. And they may get a cash bonus for signing up as well. So we call this the poverty draft. In that sense, it's not the people who are at the highest level of income, not from the most wealthy elite families, recruiting from the lower income and communities of color because they don't have as many opportunities often. And then we can talk about recruiting of children. In 2000, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the optional protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflict. There was a treaty. Over 165 countries, including the United States, signed this, which is basically says countries are not to recruit children under the age of 18. And they should take all possible measures to prevent such recruitment, including legislation that would prohibit it. And certainly those 18 younger should not be involved in hostilities. But we're really not following that. All of you have heard of the No Child Left Behind Act. In 2015, it was replaced by Every Student Succeeds Act. We replaced that. But both of them include the provision that mandated that military recruiters be allowed in high schools, in schools. And along with the personal records or contact information of those students turned over to the military so they could contact them outside of school. And so you see some examples here, just a couple of pictures of the recruiters actually in school. Lunchtime, there'll be lots of tables and exhibits set up. They give presentations. They bring all kinds of equipment, trailer loads of equipment and exhibits, semi-trailers, onto campuses of high schools. Show them video games and other things, get them to play those games. And it's all, that's the recruiting targeted towards all ages who are in those schools. Oh, and by the way, if the schools don't allow that, the federal government can penalize them financially for not allowing those recruiters into their schools. And it's the parents have the option of keeping their child's personal information private and not allowing the military to have it, but that's not much made of it, not much said about it, and sometimes the schools don't announce it and the parents don't even know that. So as I mentioned, they bring lots of equipment onto campus to try to attract, and they have special programs targeted towards what things in society we'd like to see, targeting what's called STEM, trying to stimulate science and math and engineering, people going into those fields, and use that as a recruitment into the military, because you can get this kind of experience and you can learn these kind of things and become part of that in the military. And they have specific programs targeting young women, for example, in math. We have specific military training in schools, the junior ROTC. This is in 14,000 high schools across the country, 650,000 students. She doesn't look 18 to me. And this ROTC garners for the military 10 to 15% of their enlistees. Oh, there's also an exam I forgot to mention. It's a military Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Test. That's really what, and that is ministered to those hundreds of thousands of students in thousands of high schools, and it's a major recruiting tool, as is the ROTC. This accounts for about 30% of enlistees, 25 to 30%. And then we've had the militarization of our domestic law enforcement. There's a program that was begun in 1997 called the 1033 program, which for a while was sort of put on hold and disbanded, which has recently been reinstituted. More than 460,000 pieces of military-grade weaponry and other equipment have been transferred from the Pentagon to the local police department. And that's not just small arms, but night vision goggles and devices, and light armored cars, and tank-like vehicles, and some aircraft. So we have a sort of militarized local law enforcement now, that, like the SWAT teams, for example, which conduct over 50,000 to 80,000 raids every year across the country. Some of them no-knock, which is not allowed in Oregon, but sometimes they have the wrong address. It's often for very minor things like possession of small amounts of marijuana, but that's become a standard sort of operating procedure to use in going into homes. And of course we have the collection of data through our phones and through our computers and all kinds of other devices when you drive down the street, intercepting your phone calls. This militarization has particularly caused issues with communities of color and caused lots of resentment because those kinds of things often are happening and occurring in their communities. Yeah. Just a couple of minutes. Yeah, I want to emphasize one other thing before we take questions. The media, just real quick, they're supposed to be kind of the watchdog on government, but they often become sort of the cheerleaders for the administration's war policies without really questioning and examining them. I'm going to skip this one. I'm going to go into this one because I want to emphasize just a little bit more before we go into questions. So how much are we spending on the preparation for war, and what else could we do with that? This is about what the annual discretionary budget that the Congress votes on, the President proposes every year. This is what it looks like. This is militarism and war. This is what goes into the health budget, housing, and education. It runs around $500 to $600 billion a year. So these are how our priorities are assigned in our society. It really is, rather than 500 to 600 billion, it's more like $1 million if you include everything like the Department of Energy, for example, that is responsible for nuclear weapons and storage of wastes. If you include what even the Coast Guard does, that's military, the VA, Medicare, all of the CIA, various areas, so for security, military, we're spending about $1 trillion a year. The current budget the President proposed, $603 billion, not including some additional war funding, and that proposal was $52 billion higher than in 2017. Congress even upped it by proposing 700. That should be billion, not million. It's a typo. And plus, we have a plan to modernize nuclear weapons of $355 billion in the next decade, $1 trillion over 30 years, particularly including submarines. I'm going to have to skip ahead here just a little bit. And we often hear people talking about how the military has been really suffering budget-wise. But this chart shows from 1976 through 2016, comparing the military budget with the non-military budget in the sort of goal line. And you can see how for almost all those years it has exceeded it, except from the Recovery Act of 2009. So we're still talking about $600-something billion, far greater, but it's been fairly consistently greater than it has been for all the non-military expenditures. And you often hear people talking about, well, we need to cut Medicare, we need to cut Medicaid, we need to cut this program or that program because we need to reduce the debt. But there have been calculations shown that the military budget is responsible for 22 to 44% of our national debt. So what President Eisenhower said was that every gun that's made, every warship launched, every rocket that's fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It's spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, and the hopes of its children. Martin Luther King said, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death, at his famous Riverside speech in New York City. So I'm going to real quickly just point out a couple of alternatives to that, what we could be doing with that budget. I'm trying to find my figures here because I don't hold these in my head. Okay, so instead of spending that 500 to 600 billion, that we could provide health care for 270 million children or 8 million teachers or 69 million university scholarships or wind power for 493 million houses. Often talk about jobs, and I'm going to quit with this one. Job creation. Military spending creates jobs, but here's how it compares. 11,000 jobs for the military for $1 billion of spending. That same amount Of clean energy jobs, 16,800. Or for healthcare, it would create 17,200 jobs. Or for education, it would create 26,700 for $1 billion of spending. And remember, we're talking about 600 or so $billion per year. Well, and another way of looking at amounts spent to date in Afghanistan and Iraq would bring everyone who's under the poverty line currently in the United States out of poverty every year for 30 years. Okay. Now, so I understand you've got some microphones somebody carries around for questions and comments and feedback, and then we take a break for a few minutes as well. Thank you. Any comments? There's a couple of questions down here. Or comments?
My name is Joyce, and you mentioned a couple of times about soldiers who had moral issues with serving in the service, and I wondered if today they have a conscientious objection program like they did in previous years in the United States.
Oh, I am trying to remember where that's still on the books or not. I just read that recently. I think it may be, but I'm not positive. But there were a couple of options. You could have conscious objection and have alternative service during the draft years, or you could be conscious objector of a 1A, which you would only serve in the military as a medic, and that's what I was registered as. And then we had the lottery, and my number was not ever called to go up. But there's 2 quarters of conscious objection. I think there may still be possible. Sorry, I can't remember for sure. But there was another 1 or 2 down here.
I had a question. My name's Stephen Moe.
Stephen?
I've just noticed that a lot of sporting events are very warlike as well. Like, I mean, football, obviously, soccer to some extent. And when they both of those, and plus rodeoing, are high injury sports. You know, the stakes are really high now with concussions and, I mean, the ramifications of that game. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Now, he's pointing out about how we have some, another example of sort of this violence is acceptable in society with, for example, with football, where the intent is to have a conflict, a physical conflict, as part of achieving your goal. Yes, good point there. Thank you, Joy, too, for your comment. Somewhere back here. Yes.
Yeah, my name is Bob, and I was just wondering what your opinion is of every person following graduation from high school serving 2 years for their country, not necessarily in the military, but 2 years for their country.
Well, the option of something like that rather than military, as a contrast to going into the military, if that kind of service was going to be required, then I think that option should be there to serve in another capacity that serves society. You know, it kind of goes back to the mention of, you know, firefighters, teachers, even the healthcare professionals, the police officers, though not as great extent, but you know, they're not. They don't receive the recognition. The funding is not as great for teaching as it is for the military. So they could probably welcome more well-qualified people and trained going into those kinds of services.
Hi, Cassia here. I have a question about your budget figures. You indicated.
I've lost you.
Oh, I'm here.
Sorry. Thank you.
Sorry. You gave a figure of roughly 600 to 700 billion for the military in discretionary funding. We've often heard that there is additional funding that's not listed or made public or anything like that. Is that true? And B, is there any indication of what that additional funding actually is? How much it is? And where it goes?
There is, and I'm trying to scan my notes here because I forgot to give you the actual name of it. It's called the Overseas Contingency Operations. And it's not subject to the cap for funding. And it, lost place again here. Oh, it's kind of the Pentagon's petty cash. And it's an additional $59 billion, for example, recently. It's supposedly for budget overruns, but it's about half or more doesn't end up going specific for war. It just is used in general. So yes, there is a contingency fund, operations contingency fund.
This is Charlene. I just want to make a comment on what Joyce talked about with conscientious objectors. I don't believe it's necessary because this is a voluntary army. And so they're not being drafted. So if they are objecting to it, they wouldn't go into it.
Yeah, right. I was sort of whether it still exists. If the draft was reinstituted, I think it still does. But you're certainly right. You know, if somebody's volunteering. Although there are quite a few who have gotten into the military and found out, for example, they have those moral injury kinds of things occurring, and they want out. And those, they take a conscious objection stand, and some of them go AWOL, some of them stay and they're prosecuted. So that's not uncommon. There's quite a cadre of individuals who are in that category because they're in. And is there another one back here?
Yes, my name is Bob. I'm back here. And as you know, Neville Chamberlain came back to Great Britain with the declaration, "There's peace in our time." There was an attempt to head off what became World War II by peaceful negotiations with Germany. What does a pacifist say to the militarists about the fact that we do live in a dangerous world where there are bad guys?
Well, for a more comprehensive and definitive response, I would encourage you to go to, I'm going to hand out a bibliography later, and there's a free book on there that you can get you can download, which talks specifically about what we ought to be doing as an alternative. And I'm going to show you some data in the second half of this. To what extent do we try to solve things without the violence through nonviolent conflict? And in fact, I'm going to mention that pact you're talking about too, but World War II was essentially because the people who won the war were deciding to punish. World War I were punishing rather than treating them fairly, the people who were defeated in World War I. And so that very quickly arose to World War II. So how we treat people essentially, and nonviolent ways of resolving conflict, and to what extent do we do that? And I'm going to show you some real figures about how little we emphasize that monetarily even in the U.S. in the second half.
This is Jeanette. I wanted to say that I know that conscientious objector positions are still available to those in the military, if they feel like they just can't continue. It's not an easy process. Bob, that question you asked takes a long answer, but a pacifist would say that, well, some of us hesitate to use that word. We prefer the word nonviolence, but that we need to hold our leaders accountable, and when they're going the wrong direction, we need to say something. In Germany, everybody just went along with Hitler, even the church leaders. Everybody did, and there could have been possibilities to prevent that. So after Solveig has a comment, we're going to take a 10-minute break.
Oh dear, I'm sorry. James DePriest, who was the conductor of the Oregon Symphony, was on the board of the National Endowment for the Arts, and the House Ways and Means Committee were preparing to slash that entire budget. When he testified, he said the amount that we're asking for would build 1 foot of the Trident nuclear submarine, a single Trident nuclear submarine. So he said, here's the solution. Make it 1 foot shorter, because everything looks smaller underwater, bigger underwater anyway.
Okay, I'm going to continue on here with another portion. I always like to include in this presentation a bit of a poem from our own Oregonian poet laureate. Some of you are probably familiar with William Stafford. He was a conscientious objector in World War II and did alternative service in logging in camps. This is the field where the battle did not happen, where the unknown soldier did not die, where no monument stands, no people killed or were killed on this ground, hallowed by neglect in an air so tame that people celebrated by forgetting its name. It's from his poem at the Unnational Monument along the Canadian border. That's, in a way, that's kind of our goal. Not to have any monuments to war, because there is no war. Typically in history, in our school from elementary on, we study history as a series of wars, or at least an emphasis on that. And we don't really talk much about the history of peace. And there's been more peace in the world, periods of peace, than there actually has been war. So I'm going to talk a little bit about peace history and show how much a part of our society that is. And I think you'll see how little recognition, you'll agree, how little recognition we give to that. This one is World War I demonstration, peace demonstration. I think the second one from the left here is Jane Addams, if I recall. Don't know any of these folks, but that was a more recent war protest. As you can tell, they're dressed a little differently there. The history of the human beings, war is not something that's genetic. The hundreds of thousands, 100,000 years or so of our history, only organized violence occurred in the last 10,000 years. And this is just kind of a joke about that in terms of the Homo unrealisticus and Millisimius rex there. But actually it's not something that we're destined for, to resolve our conflict violently. Just a few things about the history of peace organizations in the United States. One of the first ones was in 1815, was the first peace society, the New York Peace Society. And there's a lot that's in these gaps that I represent here. In 1915, the Women's Peace Party, which is now the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, still exists and does a number of kinds of things besides war. 1945, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist was established, and that's still in existence. They do that clock countdown. 1958, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. And today there are estimated to be 1 million organizations for peace and social justice and environmental protection. History of peace activists. There's a lot that we don't talk about or don't know about there. And again, there are lots of gaps here. I'm just highlighting a few. But in 1765, 1767, and 1770, we had some nonviolent revolutionists by the colonists related to the Stamp Act and the Townsend Act, where they just said, we're not going to use or buy or import those British items because we don't want those taxes. And they established several organizations, including the First Continental Congress, but even before that, organizations to resolve conflict and to try to settle with Britain otherwise, to assert their independence. And then the Second Continental Congress, where Washington was chosen and we were led to the war. But not many people know those were nonviolent, how early in the U.S. history. Julia Ward Howe, in her famous poem, to women, declared, "Arise then, women of this day. Voice of earth and of our own says, disarm, disarm." Around that same time period prior to World War I, there was an anti-war exhibit that toured the U.S. There was a huge anti-war movement, peace movement that met with President Wilson frequently, who promised not to go into the war. There was that exhibit that went all around the United States. Eugene Debs was imprisoned for his anti-war speech from 1918 to 1921, and ran an actual presidential campaign and got quite a few votes from jail. Of course, we had the 70s, we had the demonstrations against the Vietnam War, and particularly in the 80s, we had 1 million people protested against nuclear weapons in, I think it was New York City, maybe in the park. 2013, 4 million people signed a petition to abolish nuclear weapons. And in 2003, 36 million people worldwide in 3,000 protests against the U.S. war in Iraq, against the war in Iraq. Talking about heroes, this is an interesting piece, hero, I think. She said, "As a woman, I can't go to war, and I refuse to send anyone else." Jeanette Rankin was the first woman elected to national office. She was elected to the House of Representatives, and that's from Montana, yes. I was about to get to that. And actually, she was on a Republican ticket. She was elected and sworn in 1917, and 4 days later, she made her first vote. It was against the World War I, the U.S. entering that war. She was also elected again in 1940. And she voted against, this is where this statement came from, she voted against entering World War II against the Japanese. She got so much flack from that, including from the women's movement, that she abstained on the vote to enter the war against Germany. But she was also the first woman, or the only woman, to ever vote to give women the vote. So, and in her later years, she was 88 years old, and she led a protest of 3,000 to 5,000 people against the Vietnam War in Washington, D.C. So we do have those heroes that we need some statues to, some monuments and some museums. Oh, and the picture reminds me that she's also the first woman, I'm not sure she's still the only one, but the first woman to have a statue in Statuary Hall in the Capitol building, and that's the statement that's on that. At the end of World War I, the British and the Americans were so upset and distraught about the huge number of casualties, deaths and injuries, to both countries, that they created the Armistice Day. The war ended 11/11/11, which the anniversary is soon upon us, this being the 7th. And as a celebration of peace and to never have war again. That was what the Armistice Day was all about. And you can see that it had huge support just on that day. People were just really excited with the end of that war. In 1954, Armistice Day was changed to Veterans Day, which honors veterans, of course, but it does highlight violent conflict more than it does peaceful resolution, as it was originally intended here through the Armistice Day. This is what an Army veteran says. He was a U.S. Army Ranger, 2 deployments to Afghanistan. Says if we really wanted to honor veterans, we would abolish Veterans Day and replace it with a day that celebrates peace, not war. Peace is a better way to honor the sacrifice of veterans. So 10 years later, with lots of work from peace activists, we had signing the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which is called the Peace Pact or the Pact of Paris, which essentially said all the signers to this agree to only resolve conflict nonviolently from here on out. And in 1948, at the end of World War II, the United Nations Charter, which allows war only with the approval of the vote of the United Nations, and it only permits wars that are either approved or authorized by the United Nations or that are defensive. So by both of these measures, most wars that we've had since then have been illegal wars, according to actual documents that we have agreed to and signed as the United States. Now, there have been lots of international agreements, and I'm trying to give you a picture that despite our violence, we have made lots of progress in making peace more of a normalized condition in our society, more acceptable to resolve conflict nonviolently. And I've just picked out a few here of those agreements. Of course, the 1949 Geneva Conventions are pretty well known to folks because that's what protects prisoners, and that's the one which prohibits torture, enhanced interrogation techniques by another name. We've had agreements since then to ban weapons of mass destruction in outer space, to ban biological weapons, ban chemical weapons, to control intermediate range nuclear missiles, that ban landmines, that control the arms trade, that ban child soldiers, and established an international criminal court to try people who create crimes against humanity. So these are all flowing after, and some even recently. You can see the little asterisks after a number of those. Those are the ones that the United Nations that the United States is not a party to. We did not sign to agree on those which many other nations in the world have signed on to. The most recent, just in October, 122 nations agreed to ban nuclear weapons. Takes 50 to ratify it, and 51 ratified it the very next day. And what this does, the kind of ban that it does, it prohibits the development, the testing, the production, the manufacture, otherwise acquiring, possessing, or stockpiling, or transferring, receiving, using, threatening to use, assisting or seeking assistance, or allowing stationing of nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. 122 nations established that through the United Nations. Again, the United States and those other powers that have nuclear weapons did not agree to that or participate in it. In fact, our ambassador to the United Nations came out with a statement against it. But otherwise, around the world, lots of nations have agreed to peaceful ways of dealing with conflict. Over 450 universities and colleges have established peace programs or conflict resolution program. The United Nations has in Costa Rica the University for Peace, and excuse me, along with about 22 other nations. Costa Rica does not have a military; it's disbanded its military. Oregon State has a peace study certificate requirement. Portland State has a conflict resolution program. University of Oregon has a peace and studies conflict resolution program. Lane Community College has a peace center, and Willamette has 3 or 4 courses on nonviolent conflict resolution. So again, another example of the progress that we're making, the more greater emphasis on peace. And besides the United Nations, which is the best known organization for trying to resolve conflict, all of these others have established regional organizations for cooperation in resolving conflicts and economic cooperation. African Union, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the European Union, and the Union of South American Nations. In fact, in let's see if I can find that. Anyway, a number of nations, 31 Latin American and Caribbean nations have created a zone of peace, committing to never make use of war. So that's in addition to this organization. Have any of you seen this building in D.C.? No? Well, this building is the United States Peace Institute. It's located just up the street from the State Department, between Lincoln Memorial and the State Department. It was established in 1984 by Congress to help prevent and resolve violent conflicts and promote post-conflict peace building, increase conflict management tools, capacity, and intellectual capital worldwide. Now remember the budgets that I talked about for the military, 500 to 700 billion. The Peace Institute's budget from Congress is 35 to 40 million. 35 to 40 million. Military budget, defense budget, total everything in security, $1 trillion a year. Defense budget, 500 to 700 billion. Our Peace Institute, 35 to 40 million. And that goes mostly for fellowships and education and training and publications and research. It's never been known to oppose a U.S. war. Oh, another quote from Jane Addams relative to peace. And she won the Nobel Prize, co-winner in 1931. She's a suffragette and a peace movement activist. True peace is not merely the absence of war. It's the presence of justice. So there's an organization that conducted a study of the years 2003 to 2013. They looked at over 900 various indices and surveys and databases from 20 different sources, coming up with over 4,700 variables. That means various factors that they looked at. And this is what they found. There are 8 pillars that are associated with peace and creating a peaceful environment, and they're all interdependent and interactive with each other. A well-functioning government, equitable distribution of resources, free flow of information, sound business environment, a high level of human capital, acceptance of the rights of others, and the low levels of corruption and good relations with neighboring countries. All of those, the stronger they are, the more peaceful those countries are. So we know what it takes to create peace. We know what it takes to create peaceful environments. It's these pillars, and we can create peace. So I'm going to talk a bit more specifically about public health and some of the kind of things that I've involved in with this group, which can be seen more broadly and what we're trying to encourage health professionals to do. We take our mandates from several different places. This is one example of that, from the World Health Organization, which is part of the United Nations. The role of physicians and other health professionals in the preservation and promotion of peace is the most significant factor for the attainment of health for all. And that's kind of the foundation of our work. So here's some specific organizations in health. And I don't have them all on here because there are many, but I want to point out a few. The International Physicians for the Prevention of War is still in existence and has chapters in a number of countries. In the U.S., it's called Physicians for Social Responsibility. In England, it's called MEDAC. And they initiated this group. I forgot to mention. Well, you probably heard on the news. This group called ICANN, that's the organization that facilitated and promoted and advocated for that ban on nuclear weapons, and they just won the Nobel Peace Prize for that just a few weeks ago. So they were initiated from this organization of physicians from all over various countries. They won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985 specifically for their work on nuclear weapons. Physicians from Russia and the United States got together and they started trying to figure out what they could do to try to reduce the number of nuclear weapons. And they met with high-level officials, including Gorbachev. And he still credits this organization in helping to reduce the number of nuclear weapons. Now, the American Public Health Association, which I've been a member of since 1974, it's the world's largest organization of public health professionals, has an annual meeting going on right now. Usually has about 13,000 people attend. It's happening in Atlanta this year. But it has a peace caucus, various units, a whole number of different sections and units. It has a peace caucus. And out of that peace caucus grew this working group for the primary prevention of war. We have telephone conferences on a pretty regular basis, at least once a quarter. And we've got an active core group of about 20, including a couple people from England and somebody from South Africa. But this group, individuals in that group and this group have done a number of different kind of things. For example, the University of Washington Public Health School, Yale University, University of Chicago, Illinois has specific courses on war and health. University of Washington and Illinois both have Chicago. Both held workshops and conferences, and we do presentations. There's specific. Our group is making presentations at this annual meeting that's going on right now, today, in fact, I think, as I remember right. Individuals in that group have conducted research. One of the members led a team in publishing results of the number of people killed in the first, from 2003 to 2011 in Iraq, the fatalities and injuries there, casualties. Number of different other kinds of research that they're doing. Actually, some members of our group published research that predicted the health effects of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan before this actually started. We published individually and as a group a number of articles, one of which, we came up with 60 competencies for health professionals to work towards the prevention of war and promotion of peace. And those were published in the American Journal of Public Health a couple of years ago. And we had those in 4 domains. They should know something and have skills in about militarism, international peace work, peace advocacy, and peace research. And at the end of this month, I just found out yesterday, the book that we have put together was initiated from that group, which I and Shelley contributed chapters, and we have been the editors in organizing it. It has 21 chapters. Over 30 people contributed from Australia, from East and West Coast of the United States, from Canada, and from England, in the fields ranging from public health to sociology to law to psychology to peace and conflict studies programs. Just a whole wide, very interdisciplinary book. And we emphasize, let's go back to this. The topics emphasize essentially those things that we emphasized in the competencies. The health effects of war, we have a few chapters of that, effects on civilians and on the military. And on the environment, we have biologists who wrote that chapter, which was really good. And then we have about the causes of war, mostly emphasizing some of the things I've talked to you today about militarism. And then we have things that people can actually do, ranging from conscientious objection to advocacy. And that's sort of the heart and the crux of the book, is what health professionals can actually do to towards preventing war and promoting peace. And then there's a chapter on how to teach about it, an example syllabus, and a chapter on how to conduct research and what research emphasis ought to be. So we've worked really hard the last couple of years on this, and we're very pleased and to have such a interdisciplinary and collaborative work coming from a lot of various disciplines and across at least the Northern Hemisphere. So the question comes is, what can you and I do, those of us sitting in this room? And the list that you have, I think Jeanette handed out that list already of things we can do. I'm going to just briefly mention that, but you have a copy of it. So this is the main emphasis, is that this veteran who was mobilized in 2001, 2003, she was in the Army and in the reserves, Adrienne Kine, says, real change in this country has only ever happened through committed and persistent grassroots organizing, rooted in the belief that change is possible. So these are some of the things that we can do, and you can pick from a lot of the things I've talked about today as the priority for that, whether it's the budget or whether it's children in school. And by the way, there are several groups who do counter recruiting in schools. They go into schools where the military is recruiting there, and they talk about what it really means if you go into the military, about how they may promise you, and some of you who've been in the military know this happens, they promise you a job, let's say repairing radios, but you end up changing tires or something like that. Well, once you sign the contract, you're held to the contract, but the military is not. So you can be switched to whatever and do whatever. So they talk to them about the realistic things of what it means and about war and the effects of war. So there's a group, one group that participates in that is called Veterans for Peace. So learn as much about it as you can and share what you've learned. And in your personal relationships, practicing peace. And participate in some of these peace organizations. If you're a veteran, you could become part of that Veterans for Peace and do some of that counter-recruiting and other presentations. And actually, they've published a book written by veterans, contributing money to peace organizations. And certainly, we need to advocate to our policymakers about that budget that I've talked about, for example, and about that dedicating even more money to the term that's used is modernize our nuclear weapons. Now, if we've already got weapons that can destroy to the extent that I've mentioned to you, do they need to be modernized? Do they need to be increased in their power? So you can do advocacy with the policymakers about additional budget going into nuclear weapons. Write letters to the editor of your local newspaper. You can blog. Use your social media, Twitter and Facebook, to post things from some of these peace groups. And this is a really important one, incorporating some aspect of peace building and nonviolent conflict resolution into all kinds of health services or other kinds of services that you may be volunteering for or still working for, and programs, and certainly into K-12 to education programs. You can conduct peace education events, produce anti-war and peace art. I have a couple of friends who've done this with sculpture and with poetry and with some of their paintings. And I know that there are bound to be people in this group that have talents along those lines. And of course, participating in nonviolent resistance and protests. In the 1980s, a group of public health people, we were having our annual meeting in Las Vegas at the time when there was a nuclear test site right outside Las Vegas, and a group went out there and protested, and some took the additional step and were arrested for their crossing that line that was drawn sort of in the sand there. But there's lots of ways we can participate in all of these kinds of activities to promote peace and prevent war. One of the things that I like to do with this presentation, and I've been giving a lot here in Oregon and across the country and in Canada, and I read this pledge that 57,000 people have already signed in 150 or 60 countries around the world. And the blue scarf is kind of a symbol of that. From this group, World Beyond War, and they're the ones who are promoting this, as well as lots of conferences and workshops that go on all the time they're having, and they have books they publish. They have an online course about peace, preventing war. So I read this, and if you're so inclined, you can say the pledge along with me as I read that. If not, that's fine too. But I'm just going to read through it and sort of take this pledge again for myself, and you can join with me if you'd like. I commit to engage in and support nonviolent efforts to end all war and preparation for war, and to create a sustainable and just peace. So thank you very much for your attention and for your being here today, for participation, and we've got time for questions and other comments. I think people might have some more at this time. Be glad to have those. Thank you. Any comments, or is your hunger taking over your? I think there's some up here.
Okay, I guess I'm the first that got the mic right here. It's Irene, and
Right.
my question is around the contractors that do these are civilians. And in the past, I know there's always been some civilians that work for the military, but lately we've noticed that there's a tremendous amount of people that depend on the military for their jobs. They're civilians, contractors. And so this is a huge amount of money, and I read that there's some economists that believe that if you could eliminate that and get the military back to doing what they always did do instead of contracting everything out, you could save a lot on the military budget. And my question to you is, when did all this transition from the military doing things to now the contractors do so much? Maybe even more than the military.
Well, a part of the origins were with World War II, when the industry was mobilized to produce aircraft. That was a large part of it, and the shipbuilding and so on. And it began then and continued to build after that. And then again with the Iraq, the war in Iraq, a huge amount of it was privatized, contracted out then. And in part due to the leadership that had vested interest in that and benefited from it. So it's been sort of continuous movement towards that since the end of World War II.
My name is David, and my comment concerns the pillars of peace. And I'm very surprised that the natural environment wasn't in there, because if we can't preserve the natural environment, we're all going to be sunk.
Yes, and somehow, in trying to meet the time limit here, I must have eliminated that slide. The military has actually published, essentially, they believe in climate change, that it's happening, so on. So they sort of recognize that. However, war and the preparation for war causes a huge amount of damage to the environment. If you think back to the napalm of Vietnam that destroyed forests and croplands, to the bombs that were dropped in other wars as well, but just devastate the agricultural land because they can't farm because of those huge pits that are there from where the bombs were dropped, to the storage of waste from nuclear weapons. That you know about Hanford and those tanks there, and one of them is leaking, and actually when that was in full operations, that things leaked into the Columbia River and into the air and so on. And even the preparation for war, where these big heavy tanks drive across these lands, destroying the animals and the vegetation that are there. And the spent lead from just firing the weapons for practice, you know, is left there, and lead is harmful. And in the recent wars, there were ammunition that was radioactive, and that's still, you know, is left laying around. So the environment is a huge factor in war, and resulting from war. The effects on the environment are huge, and the direct contribution to climate change is large as well, because the military uses millions and millions of gallons of oil every year, billions of barrels, I should say. In fact, one statistic was the amount that they use in 1 year would run the entire mass transit system of the United States for 22 years. And we know that automobile exhausts and vehicle exhaust and so on contribute to the gases that are causing the air pollution that causes climate change. I think there's a question back there first, I think, somebody.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I've long been interested in the Nobel Peace Prize winners. I think began in 1906 with Teddy Roosevelt. I've long been interested in the Nobel Peace Prize winners, beginning with Teddy Roosevelt back in, I believe, 1906 with the Russo-Japanese War. And I'm wondering, is there a museum, any place in the United States or the world that actually pays tribute to who won the Nobel Peace Prize and the individual stories that we can learn from?
I think in Norway, where they're awarded, I believe there is some, but I'm not aware of another site for that, just to honor the Nobel Prize winners, Peace Prize winners.
This is Glenn. It appears to me that the conflicts that we have in Afghanistan and Iraq are mainly, for the majority of the Americans, a kind of an abstraction. And I'm wondering that with this, we have this professional military that's carrying out, but if we have conscription, it would seem to me that the whole attitude about our incursion in these conflicts would change.
It's true that we don't have much effect from the war. I mean, we see the veterans sometimes who have a physical effect, and we see these exhibits at football games and so on. But does it really touch us? For the most part, the people that it touches are the families and the veterans themselves and the soldiers. So the total society is removed from that and don't feel those effects as much as it did, say, during the Vietnam War, which probably contributed heavily to the anti-war feelings in the United States. Even though there was a lot of conflict around that, there was a large, because of the effect that everybody was seeing. Everybody, theoretically, was subject to the draft, and now they are volunteers, and they have this sort of, it has that career kind of an attachment to it. And some of them are not expecting to have to end up in the combat zone when it happens. And so, yeah, we don't even see the coffins as they're carried off the airplanes anymore like we did at one time. You know, the flag-draped coffins and the ceremonies around them being brought back. So, yeah, there's very little that most people are touched by, that they're aware of. They're heavily touched by the budget. But that sort of is, again, it's more abstract than a real family member having an effect. I guess up here is next.
I wonder if there have been some benefits of war that I noticed wasn't included in your talk. I mean, I'm not saying it's a direct trade-off between the two.
Yeah.
For example, inventions, improvements out of necessity of war. Some things are created that normally might not have been. I mean, there's a whole list of improvements to daily living. I'm not saying the trade-off is
Well,
the same, but
for example, one of the slides I showed where the prosthetics that the veteran was wearing, and there's surgery and things that have been developed to take care of somebody who's wounded, and the rehabilitation and so on. I would rather have those kinds of discoveries be made on treatment of people, let's say, in automobile and vehicle wrecks, rather than going to war to achieve those kind of advancements. To be putting those into other kinds of research and discovery. I'm glad that those soldiers have those kinds of treatments, but I think society could invest its money in other ways to try to, and it would achieve some of those same kind of things. Although it does have some broader military applications, there have been huge amounts of discoveries made with our space programs that have come into a civilian society. So I would say let's do that kind of research about how to treat people with injuries. Let's do it for victims of car wrecks instead of sending people to war to make those discoveries. Other comments? Well, thank you all for those comments. Appreciate it.